From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden released his fiscal 2025 budget in Washington on Monday. What does the document tell us about the president's priorities and what he might do if he wins a second term? Plus, a bill to force a divestment of the social media app TikTok from its Chinese ownership is moving quickly through the House. Welcome to Potomac Watch. My name's Kate Batchelder Odell, and I'm here today with my talented colleagues, columnist and editorial board member Alicia Finley, as well as editorial board member Mine Ukwe-Barua. Thanks both for being here. Let's dive right in. The president puts out a budget every year, and on Monday, he came out with his fiscal 25 requests, about $7.3 trillion total. This is an important day for policy wonks, a high day on our liturgical calendar, if you will. But I'll make the case here that this is an important document for understanding what President Biden thinks about what his priorities should be for the rest of his administration and what he might do if he were to win a second term. So, Alicia, let's walk through your top line impressions of looking at this budget document. I mean, my initial takeaway is that there are some ferocious tax increases in this document, many of which don't have a good chance of becoming law anytime soon. Why don't you walk us through what President Biden's tax system really looks like if he were to have his way?
Under his budget, you'd see trillions of dollars, about, I think, $3 trillion in higher taxes over the next decade, and which actually, if you think about it in the big scheme of things, isn't that big, considering that the debt is expected to grow by a little over $20 trillion over the next decade. But what you see in his budget is a lot of the things that he teed up during his State of the Union, which is increasing the corporate tax rate to 28% from 21%, an increase in the alternative minimum tax, and this is separate from the actual alternative minimum tax. This is on just book income, so that's the kind of income that corporations report on their financial statements, which excludes a lot of various deductions. And right now, that's at 15%, and that was actually a new addition in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, Biden is proposing to increase that minimum tax to 21%. He's also proposing, if you recall, the editorial pages have written a lot on this new global tax agreement in the OECD, which would set a tax floor of 15%. Biden has been lobbying Congress to impose it, saying, well, if we don't, American companies are just going to get taxed more by these other countries, and so we should impose it nonetheless so we can get our fair share of the revenues. Well, it's interesting now Biden is kind of actually proposing to break the whole tax agreement by suggesting raising the rate to 21% instead of 15%. And I don't even think you could get a lot of the European countries to go along with that, the ones that actually push for the OECD agreement. There's also an increase. He wants to increase the top marginal rate to 39.6% from 37%. That will actually automatically go up with the expiration of the 2017 tax reforms. But in addition, he wants to apply that 39.6% rate to capital gains for people earning over $400,000. And that would be up from about 20% right now. So that's just a massive increase. Plus, he plans to layer on an additional 5% Medicare tax on that. So you could actually see the top federal rate increasing to around 45%, layer on state and local taxes in places like California and New York, and you're nearly at 60%. And so those are just the highlights of the taxes. There are various other small things that he proposes to do, like eliminating numerous deductions for oil and gas companies now take advantage of, capping or eliminating actually the deduction for corporate executives. And that actually just doesn't raise that much revenue. And I think that's really the big picture of all this, is that you just take a step back, even with all these tax proposals that Biden has put on the table, and these would be the biggest tax increases in history. Your budget still only projects that revenue will rise to about 20.3% of GDP. It's only gotten to 20% one time in all of history. And the average over the last 50 or so years has been 17.3%. All these tax increases really aren't going to make a dent in the deficit. What they'll do is just depress economic growth.
I think that's a really good point on the share of the economy and revenues. I mean, tax receipts are very healthy, on track to fit 18.7% of the economy in 2025. And the average since 1974 was 17.3%. So I think what that really underscores, to your point is that we don't have a tax receipt problem, we have a spending problem. Because if you look at these budget projections, I mean, we're talking about going to spending that reaches a quarter of national wealth. Mitch McConnell was on the floor Tuesday talking about this and said, we're talking about tax and spending levels that approach World War II, but we are not going to be spending any of that on national defense. And I thought I might raise that subject here in our conversation because what's so striking in this budget release is that you have any number of spending priorities. Some that just come to mind are you have President Biden wants to expand child tax credit back to a large $3,000 for older children, fully refundable, meaning you get it as a payment. This is a huge entitlement. He proposed, again, subsidized childcare with subsidies going to anybody earning up to $200,000, which is a large amount of money in parts of this country. Also, a new paid family leave entitlement. These are enormous spending programs. But the one thing that President Biden is not interested in spending on is our national defense. The Defense Department in this budget is at $850 billion, and it's about 1% over the department's budget in 2024. So it's the fourth time in a row that Biden has proposed a real cut to defense after inflation. And if you think about what's happened since the 2024 budget request, that includes October 7th in Israel. We've had Iranian proxies that are firing drones and rockets at U.S. troops in the Middle East. You have terrorists in Yemen that are taking a global shipping lane hostage. You have ferocious increases in defense spending by the Chinese. So it's just an incredibly odd dichotomy here to have this budget document that is so divorced from the reality of the world, but also seems as though it could continue spending on any other priority. One thing we haven't talked about yet is Social Security, which President Biden made a point about. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about his own Social Security priorities in his budget.
Folks, we have two ways to go at Social Security and Medicare. Republicans will cut Social Security and Medicare to give us more tax cuts for the wealthy. Even this morning, Donald Trump said cuts to Social Security and Medicare are on the table again. But the bottom line is he's still at it. I'm never going to allow that to happen. I won't cut Social Security. I won't cut Medicare. Instead of cutting Medicare and give tax breaks to the wealthy, I will protect and strengthen Social Security and Medicare and make the wealthy begin to pay their fair share.
Monet, what's your reaction to this pure demagoguery on Social Security? Do you know of any Republicans who have the mettle to reform Social Security anymore? What do you make of the president's remarks?
Within the past decade, we've gone from a Republican Party where there were active proposals being put on the table by Paul Ryan and others for how to rationalize the system, because on the current pace, we're going to have automatic mandatory cuts across the board by about 2032. And so the system needs to be reformed if it's going to remain solvent. And yet we have seen that issue play out electorally as an extremely difficult one to touch, even with very rational reforms that ask for small changes like increasing the retirement age slightly, making those changes only for people who are currently very young and have paid very little in payroll taxes thus far, and other little changes that are designed to make the system just a little bit more sustainable. And yet Republicans get pilloried whenever they were releasing proposals of this kind. And so generally they've backed off the issue. And Donald Trump's candidacy really cemented that change. You see very few Republicans who are willing to go anywhere near the issue. And yet Democrats know that it's a big winner for them, and that in the minds of some voters, they're very willing to believe, despite the lack of evidence, that there are looming plans for dramatic, immediate cuts to Social Security and other entitlements. And so you're going to continue to see President Biden make that case in his budget and elsewhere that re-electing him is the only bulwark against immediate entitlement cuts. That would be very deep. The irony is that these are conversations that both parties ought to be having, but the political climate makes it almost impossible to do that. And so I think anyone viewing the Biden budget should take his statements on that issue with a grain of salt and know that it's just playing politics. But what we do need is an opportunity for Republicans to actually begin to have conversations about what the most feasible plans would look like, and to demonstrate some of the courage to actually talk about entitlement reform in a way that's going to re-enter it into the public conversation and put us on pace to actually get some kind of compromise.
Hang tight. We'll be back with more Potomac Watch in a moment. We're back with Potomac Watch. I'm Kate Batchelder-Odell, and I'm here with my colleagues Alicia and Monet, and we're talking about the federal budget and Biden's proposal. So, Alicia, one striking chart you sent me from the Biden budget request is really looking at just how large some of our entitlement priorities have gotten. And I'm thinking in particular of a chart that shows that federal aid to state and local governments, which includes entitlement aid like Medicaid, outstrips our spending on national defense. I mean, this is a really startling point. And we've been talking on this show with some regularity that net interest on the federal debt is also set to outstrip our defense spending. What does this tell you about the country's ability to reorganize its fiscal priorities? And do you see any shot at getting after the real driver of the problem, as Monet is pointing out, is Social Security?
Right. So entitlements in broadly defined, and these are programs that essentially run on autopilot. They don't need discretionary. They don't need congressional appropriations every year. Those constitute about 2/3 of the budget. In terms of the state and local governments, the problem is that they've been really dependent, or they've become increasingly reliant on the federal government for money. And essentially what the federal government does is borrow more and more. And by the way, states have balanced budget amendments, so they can't actually do what the federal government does, which is essentially borrow to pay their bills. But what states do is essentially they just get increasing amount of allocations from their federal government. So that right now, federal government grants to state and local governments is about $1.1 trillion, which is about $250 billion more than federal defense spending. Now, a lot of that is Medicaid. About a third of that is Medicaid, but there's still a lot for public transit, K through 12 education. You have the big bucket of what is called income security programs, and these can include essentially grant programs or free school lunches, money that gets distributed to the states to allocate to their populations. And this has been growing actually much faster than many other areas of the budget, all these combined in inflation-adjusted terms, actually. The aid to the states has increased by 12.5% since 2020, which is, again, striking because 2020, that wasn't exactly a low year. That was during the first year of the pandemic, and when aid to the states actually increased tremendously. If you go back to 2015, and this is again in inflation-adjusted terms, aid to the states has increased by 40%. If you've been looking at the job numbers lately, over half of the increase has been from social assistance, healthcare, and state and local government. And a lot of that is because the federal largesse is continuing to flow to the states. And one problem the states are having, though, is that their labor costs and their spending is increasing faster than the actual distributions and their tax revenue. Now, that's a separate issue. But going back to the federal fisc, the problem isn't just that more and more people are dependent on welfare. It's the fact that more and more governments, I think, are too, as well as these kind of nonprofit entities that distribute federal funds, which makes it all the harder to actually roll back some of these programs. You have states like Wyoming, Montana, and everyone wants their share of the lard. So there's a large constituency for more entitlement spending.
Monet, I want to give you a quick last word here before we move on. We know that a lot of this is Fantasyland and is not going to become law, but there is a live debate on Capitol Hill about expiring tax provisions from the 2017 Trump tax cuts, for instance. What do you see in this budget that might become a live part of a larger negotiation? How is it being received on Capitol Hill?
So we are going to see the expiration of the income tax cuts that Republicans managed to enact in 2017 under President Trump. President Biden has come out early and said that he wants to preserve those cuts for everyone who earns less than $400,000. So that would mean all but that top income tax rate, which would go up from 37% to 39.7% after the expiration. He wants to preserve. But I think everyone on Capitol Hill knows that that's going to come with a price. He's not going to push Democrats to go ahead and preserve those tax cuts simply as they are, but is going to want to get leverage from, rather preserving those lower tax rates is going to be used as leverage to pull Republicans into joining on some kind of extension of other Democratic tax priorities. And so the child tax credit, which you mentioned already, probably is one of the bigger provisions that they'll hope to fold into some kind of broader tax deal at that point. And we've already seen Republicans start to embrace the child tax credit in the current Congress. It has been included in a deal that would extend some business tax cuts that were passed in the 27 tax bill with a larger and extended child tax credit. It doesn't currently seem like it has enough support to pass in the Senate among a lot of obstinate Republicans. But I do think that as you get closer to the possibility of those individual tax rates rising, you're going to see Democrats making the case that that is a provision that could be included in a larger deal. And so voters who are looking at what is the substance in Biden's tax priorities that they can parse from this budget should look at that as one of the main provisions and understand that there are going to be pending negotiations using individual income tax rates as leverage to try to turn some of these fantasy tax policies into realities.